All right, so the last time we were here, we discussed pre-Columbian America and a few of the cultures and peoples that lived in the vast wilderness known as North and South America. And now we must examine the people about to interact with these native tribes. What motivated their exploration? What took them so long to discover the New World? Now, to answer these questions, we're going to explore the motivations for the Age of Discovery. We will explore a few of the adventurers who conducted these expeditions, the creation of the Spanish Empire, and English challenges to Spanish hegemony of this vast new empire. So, obviously, we're going to look at what's going on in Europe between about 1450 and 1588. Well, not really what's going on in Europe, but how Europeans are interacting initially with the North America and South America. So in 1492, this is the world according to Europeans. This is about what they believed was going on. So you can see they had mapped the western coast of Africa. They knew obviously about Europe, the Middle East, India, and China, and some of these islands in Indonesia. This is obviously the trade networks that had existed for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. And Romans had access to these trade routes. They controlled most of this area in the Middle East. They had access to the Silk Road going across Asia into China. And so we know that Europeans had access to these markets. However, with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, Europe fell into what some historians call the Dark Ages. Now we can discuss if that term is fair or not, but suffice it to say, by 600 and 700 AD, Europe was almost entirely surrounded by hostile forces. In other words, Muslim invaders. Muslims had taken over North Africa. They had taken parts of Spain by the year 711. The Byzantine Empire, which was the remnants of the Roman Empire, still surviving in sort of the eastern areas of Greece and Turkey and parts of the Middle East and North Africa, were under constant attack from around 730 or so all the way to their collapse in 1453. So we know that Muslim conquerors are taking the southern part of the Mediterranean and cutting off that valuable trade to Europeans, which is why they're in an economic downturn for several hundred years. Now, when we get to around the year 1096, right, 1096, that's when the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Alexei, sends a letter to Urban II, the Pope, in Rome, and requests help. For hundreds of years, the Byzantine Empire has been slowly losing a war against constant invasion and attack by Muslims, and it's come time for him to ask for help. And so hordes of European knights and warriors are going to attempt to recapture this, what once was Roman territory, which once was Christian territory. Now, the military success of these invasions are, up for debate. They had some temporary successes here and there, but for the most part, Muslims would maintain control of this region for a very long time, even to this day, really. The main thing I'd like to mention in terms of these crusades, these holy wars, is how it forced the opening up of trade again. So Europeans are once again going to be trading with the Silk Road, with these Middle Eastern traders, because port cities like Antioch and cities like Jerusalem are going to be opened up to Christians. This is going to be a great opportunity for European countries to start making some money. And the principal country that's going to do this, and I know I'm using the word country, that's kind of not really fair. Italy isn't a country into the 1850s, but it's a geographical region, and these Italian kingdoms, city-states, are going to become incredibly wealthy compared to the other Europeans, starting in around 1300. And so that's the reason why you have this Italian Renaissance, this explosion of artistic growth and development. Cultural achievements are going to be had. You've got the great works of all the Ninja Turtles, Raphael, Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo. All of these men are going to be creating amazing works of art that still, to this day, are some of the most impressive and inspiring works of art created by people. So the Italian Renaissance is fueled by this wealth. It's fueled by this trade that's created as a result of the Crusades. Other countries are going to get jealous of this. They're having to pay high dollar because of these middlemen. These Italians are raising prices on all these goods. So it's, what these other countries want to do is, well, they want to go to Sam's, right? They want to go to Costco. They want to go to the place where they can buy these products at dirt bottom prices and then bring them back and sell them for, let's say 100% markup, but it's still going to be less than what Italy could charge. I mean, so and the reason I made up that number, 100% markup, that's purely a number I'm making up. I mean, essentially, what I mean to say is, by the time silk from China makes its way all the way across these tiny little towns through the Silk Road, all the way across Asia and into the Middle East, every single town where that product stops, the price goes up. Because the people who are traveling have to make money. So by the time this product gets all the way across the thousands of miles and the hundreds of little trading posts, you're paying a lot more for that product than you would if you just went to China and got it. So, Italy is the last middleman on this very long road, which obviously is necessary. It made trade possible. But if you're a European country, you're paying the most expensive prices for these commodities. So it's going to be in the interest of these European countries, particularly the ones who are without access to the Mediterranean, who don't have that close tie to the Middle East, to try to find an alternate route. And that's going to be what kind of spurs one of the reasons that European countries are going to start thinking about, well, we need to find another way to get to these valuable trade routes. So gold is definitely a motivation that we don't need to ignore here, right? The gold, the access to this wealthy trade network is incredibly important, but I don't want you to think that the other motivations for exploration are not as important, right? Because we all know the 3 G's, right? The gold, the God, and the glory. I mentioned gold first, but God is not to be understated. I mean, this was a major motivation for exploration. I'll give you just a couple of examples here. I can think of Portugal, for example, who's going to lead this exploration off the Atlantic coast, right here off the Iberian Peninsula. One of their goals in exploration in Africa, to try to connect with this Christian kingdom somewhere in Eastern Africa. They want to link up with this Christian kingdom. They want to work with them to invade the Middle East from another direction, right? Take a different flank, attack Arabia, go in from, to India and attack the Middle East from behind them, and then launch an attack from the front. So sort of like a pincer movement. I'm not saying they actually did this, they didn't, but this was one of the legitimate ideas, to spread Christianity, to help Christians combat and fight Muslims that had conquered and taken control of these valuable holy lands and trade routes. Other examples of the sincerity of the religious motivation of these people, I'll give you Christopher Columbus, who, his namesake, Christopher, Saint Christopher, was known for taking Christ across a body of water, right? So Saint Christopher is the man who helped ferry baby Jesus across a river into the Holy Land to return to his native land after exile. And so Columbus took that to heart. He was a sincere religious man. He believed that it was his destiny to take Christ across the water into this new world, which he didn't know about North and South America, of course, but he did know about China, and he wanted to bring Christianity into these areas and spread the gospel. So don't think that because I'm mentioning God second that it's not important. It is an incredibly important motivation for these people. It's a very sincere motivation for these people. Even conquistadors like Hernando Cortez, he had celebrated Mass 4 times a day. I mean, these people were sincerely religious. You don't go to Mass 4 times a day unless you're seriously religious or you have a whole lot to confess about, which that's something we can talk about later. Regardless, so gold and God are 2 of the very big motivations that are going to inspire exploration. Another motivation, another one of those G's, is the glory. A lot of these explorers were second, third born sons. They would not inherit anything from their fathers, and they wanted title and land as a way to survive in the world, as a way to not be a pauper. I mean, you basically had two or maybe three choices here to not be a pauper. You could inherit land, you could join the priesthood and work your way up through the hierarchy in the church and hopefully make a name and some money for yourself, or you could join the military and you could fight in a glorious campaign in service of the king and receive a title and land. And those were your options. And so if you look at these early explorers, they're mostly coming from Spain and Portugal for reasons that I'll try to explain in a little bit. But so the glory part we definitely need to keep in mind as well. All right. The last thing here I want to talk about just briefly is, why is it that Spain and Portugal are the ones who are going to launch this invasion? They have access to, well, Portugal doesn't, but Spain has access to the Mediterranean. And true, they could do the same thing Italy did with the Middle East. They could travel to Italy, they could buy the products and bring them back to Spain, sell them for a markup even more, and try to sell it to France. And maybe, but I mean, France had access and they were closer to Italy, so that wouldn't have worked. But you would think that they might try to work within the existing system, the trade routes that existed, rather than try to break the mold. Well, one of the reasons why the Iberian Peninsula is going to do this is because they have no access to the Mediterranean, right? They're on the outside, they're on the Atlantic coast. But you could say the same thing about England. England is also without access to the Mediterranean. So, why wasn't England the first one to launch into these exploratory expeditions? I'm going to offer you my explanation, which may not be the best, but it's what I'm going to offer you. And that is, I think it has to do with a lot of the technologies that were available in the Iberian Peninsula that perhaps weren't as readily available in other parts of Europe. And that resulted from the fact that Muslims had conquered Spain. In the year 711 AD, Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula and dominated it and ruled it until the Christians finally defeated them in January of 1492 and pushed them out of the peninsula. But what they left behind were technologies. Because Spain, controlled by the Muslims, still had contact with these trade routes throughout North Africa and the Indian Ocean trade, they had access to technologies like lantern sails, these triangular sails that you could sail into the wind with, regardless of the direction you wanted to go. You could sail in the direction you desired. Other things included the astrolabe, which is a Greek invention that was modified and improved on by the Muslims that aided in your navigation and knowing where you were. And that's a big deal. You're sailing in a massive ocean. You get lost, you die. So it's very important that you know exactly where you are so that you can live to trade. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's Spain and Portugal who are going to lead this exploratory moment in European history. But don't leave the English out. They're going to jump on board pretty quickly, as we'll find out in the late 1400s. But it will be the Portuguese who are going to start this thing off. So let's start by just talk about the Portuguese. All right. So what are the trade routes of this time? Well, obviously I mentioned the Silk Road going across Asia and into Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, which is it's the remnants of Rome, right? And you also have these trade routes through the Indian Ocean trade up through the Middle East to the Mediterranean coast. So all these trade routes are very valuable, and they're allowing Italy to get very wealthy, right? The Portuguese are going to start bouncing around the coast of Africa to try to find another way, another all-water route way to get to India. And then, once they link into this trade, they can go through the Straits of Malacca and up through to China, perhaps. All of this is risky business, and in the mid-1400s, they're going to start doing it. Now, the reason the Portuguese do this is because they're financed by the Prince Henry the Navigator, who was one of the rulers and the leaders in Portugal, and he's going to open a school of navigation to help the Portuguese learn how to navigate around Africa and link into this. By the 1480s, the late 1480s, they found it. Bartholomew Diaz had traveled around this turn in Africa and going all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope, and had sailed back to Portugal like, yep, I know the way. I've made contact. We know how to get there. Which kind of puts into context Columbus going to Portugal saying, hey, I've got this other idea. Why don't we just sail all the way across the Atlantic, come out on the other end, and, we can trade that way. The Portuguese said no. I think for probably more than two reasons, but two reasons that I'm going to give you. They said no. One, they already had the route, right? By the 1480s, they knew how they wanted to go. This was a much shorter route. They were certain. So they already knew how they were going to get to India and China. They didn't need an experimental route. And the second reason is they didn't need an experimental route is they knew it was suicide. There was, unlike some popular, mythology, Europeans at this time knew how big around the Earth was. They knew the circumference of the Earth, and they knew that if you set sail from Portugal across the Atlantic and you had to go all the way to the other side, it was too big. You would run out of food and water. You would die. What they didn't know is that there was all this land that you would run into where you could refuel, where it would be like a massive, let's be honest with it, the Americas for a very long time was just an inconvenient speed bump to people trying to get to China and India for trade. And it wouldn't be until the Spanish, discover vast wealth and resources that other countries are going to jump on board this speed bump and try to make some wealth out of it. Okay, now what is Portugal doing? Right, so they've turned Columbus down. They've got Bartholomew Diaz bouncing around the coast of Africa, finding the way around. By 1497, 1498, Vasco da Gama is going to make a trip, and he's this blue line that you see. Going around the coast of Africa and then bouncing up along these trading centers and then across to India. So he's going to be the first European to make this trip, and he's going to find it to be not all that fantastic, honestly. I mean, the Europeans are poor. They don't have a lot of, gold and wealth per se. They don't have any products that are of high enough quality that Indians and Chinese are willing to give up silk for it, or priceless, cinnamon and spices. So the Europeans get here and they have some barrels of moth-eaten cloth, and the people in Calcutta just kind of laugh at them like, we don't really want to trade with you. We have no reason to trade with you. So the Europeans go back a little sad and dejected, but they are not to be outdone. They will return. This time they're going to give them an offer they can't refuse, right? So the Portuguese are going to show up with their guns and they're going to shoot you. Like, okay, well, how about your life? Is that valuable enough for me to get some silk? Because I will shoot you if you don't trade with me. That's the kind of attitude that the Portuguese took up. And they started to use their gunboats and ships to attack and take over key ports throughout the Indian Ocean trade. A trade network that had been going on since, for hundreds and hundreds of years without any real regulation, without any real, antagonism. Because everyone had things to trade. And here come the Europeans who are very poor, and so they start pulling out the guns and forcing trade to happen. They start taking over certain key choke points, like the Straits of Malacca, right here, the Straits of Malacca, which you have to travel through. And so they start taxing it. If you don't have anything valuable to trade, just put a gun up there and extort money from the people who do have things to trade. So that's sort of a highly simplistic explanation of what the Portuguese do, but it will suffice. One place the Portuguese actually do find trading partners is in West Africa, particularly the slave traders in West Africa. So a lot of African chieftains were already trading in slaves. African slavery is nothing new. It wasn't invented by Europeans. In fact, slavery wasn't invented by Africa either. Slavery is old as civilization itself. It's an ancient institution, unfortunately, that no one even thought about being a moral question to it, right? Rome was based on slave labor. The Chinese had eunuchs and slaves. The Muslims were known to enslave people. And this is nothing new. And so the Africans were no different. And so African chieftains would have these captives. Portuguese traders would come by and say, hey, would you be willing to sell some of these captives? And that's where the African slave trade is going to start kicking off. With Portuguese trying to make some money off of these expeditions that they're making. All right. But Portugal's not the only country to jump in on this. Other countries, as I mentioned, are going to follow up. The Portuguese are doing this in the 1480s and the 1490s. Spain, as I already mentioned, they're going to jump on with Christopher Columbus. So we're going to take a look at some of these other explorers and what they're doing. So Christopher Columbus, after being rejected by Portugal, he goes to Spain, who is a little late to the exploration game, to tell you the truth. I mean, Spain is very old, very late to this game. For 700 years, they've been fighting Muslims, trying to reconquer their peninsula, La Reconquista de España. They're trying to reconquest Spain from the Muslims. In January of 1492, they are successful. They kicked the Muslims out. So now they're looking around like, okay, we're coming up for air. We've been fighting this war for 700 years. Now what do we do? And so Portugal is making money off the slave trade and linking into the Indian Ocean trade. So Spain says, okay, well let's do the same thing, but we can't go down Africa because Portugal will get mad at us. So we need an alternate route. And so Columbus's idea actually makes some sense to them. And they're going to finance his expedition. They're going to finance his initial expedition, and I think they set sail in August of 1492, and they will sail across the ocean blue, as the little rhyme goes. And so Columbus in 1492 will make his first of 4 different expeditions across the Atlantic into what he believed was India, what he believed he was going into the Far East. Essentially, Columbus discovered a completely different continent. Of course, he never knew that for his whole life. He never realized that he discovered something new. But essentially, he landed in a little island in the Bahamas, which he called Our Savior, San Salvador, because his men were on the verge of mutiny. And he was lying to them the whole way on the voyage, like, yeah, we've only gone 5 miles, guys. We're not that far away from home. And in fact, he'd gone like 20, right? So the journey was stretching on a little longer. Men were starting to get nervous. But by October, they were starting to see some seabirds, and hope was that land was very nearby. And of course, October 12th, Columbus Day, unless I'm wrong about that. I'm pretty sure that's right, is when Columbus landed on this little island. Now, upon landing here, he's going to move around Cuba and explore there. He's going to make several expeditions back and forth to Cuba. Eventually, he will even make his way to the Yucatan Peninsula and discover that there's a lot more here. But he's not the only one to do that. Like I said, the English are going to get on board with this in 1497 when Vasco da Gama is making his way around Africa and into India. Another Portuguese sailor, navigator, will be hired by King Henry VII. Who, of course, England wasn't involved in this trade stuff earlier because they were involved in their own little civil war. You have the War of the Roses going on between the Yorks and the Lancasters. So that civil war kind of wraps up. Henry VII emerges as the king, and he's taking a breath of fresh air, saying, okay, well, what's going on? Well, there's exploration. Okay, well, let's jump on board that. So the English are going to jump on board by hiring John Cabot, who's just going to sail straight across and get to Newfoundland and kind of make his way through the St. Lawrence, in the northern part here in what's Canada. Another explorer, this one is French, because the French are not to be outdone. They're going to be trying to get on board with this as well, is Giovanni de Verrazzano. He was born in the Republic of Florence in 1485, but like I said, the Spanish are finding some success here. By the 1520s, you've got the collapse of the Aztec. You've got immense amounts of gold and valuables being raked in, and the Spanish are getting very wealthy. So France is going to get on board with that as well. Francis I, the king, is going to commission Verrazzano to explore the landmass. And the whole purpose of this is to get around this speed bump, right? This entire continent is an unfortunate barrier to what we want to go to. What we want to go to is China and India. So Francis tells him, okay, I want you to sail around. Here's Verrazano going from France. He goes across in 1524. Sail around, find a way through this land to China and India. And this is one of the first European explorations of the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States. He sailed from what is today Virginia all the way up through New York and Maine, back across. And he even gave this new territory a name. He called it Francesca, named it after King Francis. We'd see how long that would last. It wouldn't last very long, mainly because the French aren't going to put people there, and if there aren't people living there, your name's not going to last. Other examples of European exploration of North America and what would become the United States. Another famous example is that of Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca was a part of another expedition, Alvo Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. He was born in the late 1480s and one of the few men to survive what was known as the Narvaez expedition in 1527. Pánfilo de Narvaez was hired or commissioned to go on an exploration of the Gulf of Mexico, what is today the Gulf Coast. 600 men arrived, and only 4 people survived this expedition. Cabeza de Vaca was one of the lucky few who actually did that, along with his servant, Stephen. I believe his name was Stephen. They're some of the first Europeans to have a recorded visit of the Mississippi River, and they actually went through Texas. So what happened was they suffered a shipwreck. They were forced to walk along the coast. Indians made life a little uncomfortable. Hostile natives and disease forced them to build rafts out of necessity, and then they jumped on their raft trying to get back to Cuba and got caught up in another storm, and they blew up on the island of Galveston, where some local natives, and of course natives in the Gulf Coast of Texas, for example, like the Attakapaw, they were cannibals. They were not friendly, and so many of these shipwrecked Spaniards found themselves slaves. Cabeza de Vaca was one of them. He eventually escaped from native captivity and walked all the way back to Mexico City, where he wrote a book of his travels and became one of the early explorers of Texas. Other exploration. Of course, I mentioned the capture of Tenochtitlan, which was put under siege between May and August of 1521, and the capture of Atahualpa, which I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, so my apologies to all the Incans in the audience, in 1532, and that was the collapse of the Inca civilization. So these were the two big civilizations in the Americas. There really weren't that many massive civilizations in either North or South America. Most of the population of the Americas lived in Mesoamerica, in the Aztec, the Maya, and the Inca in South America and the Andes Mountains. This is where the bulk of the population was. As we mentioned in the previous lecture, only about 1 million people, and that's, I don't know how they estimate these things, but according to the sources I've read, about 1 million natives lived in all of North America. That's not a whole lot of people. So it's sparsely populated. Most of your population centers are in Mesoamerica, and so the Spanish are going to conquer the Aztec and gain a tremendous amount of gold and wealth from this. And the same thing is true with the Inca. The Inca, unhappily, had a civil war, and the Spanish are going to take advantage of that. In 1528, the emperor of the Incan Empire, he died of smallpox, which is one of the many cultural exchanges that occurred between the Spanish and the natives. It's a deadly, deadly disease that wipes out tens and tens of millions of natives are going to be wiped out by this disease. Huayna Capac, who was the Incan emperor, is one of these victims. In 1528, he's going to die. And so his 2 sons are battling over who's going to be the new Incan ruler. And it's a little bit funny that almost as soon as the Civil War is over, the Spanish are like, here I am. And so this brand new emperor, he finally defeated his brother, only to discover the Pizarro brothers there to conquer his empire and subjugate them to the will of Spain. But these are the 2 biggest empires, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here. That's your world history class. But suffice it to say, those are going to be incredibly wealthy examples, and other countries are going to hope to mimic them. Other explorers, principally in North America, Ponce de Leon, 1513, he's going to make an expedition across into what is today Florida. Born in 1474, Juan Ponce de Leon served as the first governor of Puerto Rico between 1508 and 1509. He died in Cuba at the age of 47 in 1521. He originally came to the New World as a volunteer. He traveled with Columbus in his second expedition in 1493, but he gained enough wealth from his plantations that he eventually became a leader, a political leader, as I mentioned, in Puerto Rico. After a lengthy legal battle with Diego Columbus, who was Columbus's son, Ponce de Leon would abandon his position and lead the first expedition or exploration of Florida in 1513. He returned to Spain the following year. King Ferdinand appointed Ponce de Leon the governor of Puerto Rico, as I mentioned, and commissioned him to establish a Spanish colony in Florida. These goals were placed on hold after Ferdinand's death in 1516, while Ponce de Leon defended his titles and land grants at the court. His death marked the end of Spanish attempts to colonize Florida in 1521. And of course, the oldest settlement in all of North America, we know, is St. Augustine, Florida. It's the oldest settlement by Europeans that's in North America. Hernando de Soto went on an expedition between 1539 and 1542. He participated in a number of expeditions, including he was involved with the Pizarro brothers and Inca, with the Inca in Peru. He's also known for exploring Alabama and Arkansas. So he went all the way up to what is today Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, and into parts of Arkansas and Louisiana. And then famously you have Coronado. Between 1540 and 1542, Coronado traveled up in what would become the American Southwest through parts of Arizona, New Mexico, into Santa Fe, and that's looking for gold, right? He's looking for the city of gold. Every place he went, he was looking for gold because Cortez found gold. Why can't he? He kept expecting another large civilization that he could exploit, like Cortez and Pizarro. Unfortunately, there was nothing in North America for him to exploit in that way. As we mentioned in the previous lecture, there was a North American civilization, not quite a civilization, but a confederacy of the Iroquois were quite influential, but that's in the eastern coast of what is today the United States, and the Spanish never got that far. All right, so the Spanish are doing all this exploration. They're trying to find more gold. They're trying to replicate the successes of Cortez and Pizarro with very little success, but they're going to claim everything, right? So they land in San Salvador in 1492, and they claim everything. They're like Mufasa, everything the light touches, that everything belongs to them. The problem is the Spanish, they are incapable of holding on to this kind of territory. They don't have the population in Spain to actually do this. Other countries are going to quickly jump on board, as we'll find out, and exploit their weakness in order to claim some territory for themselves. But the Spanish are going to claim everything. All throughout the Andes and northern South America, all the way up Central America, and all the way into what is now California and Oregon. On all of this territory, they are going to claim. It's just a matter of who can put soldiers there, who can put missionaries there, who can actually hold it. Possession is 9/10 of the law. So whoever holds the land is the person who will get credit for it. And as I mentioned, most of this territory is unpopular. Nobody lives here. It's just buffalo herds and little pockets of native tribes here and there. Unfortunately for the natives, they've created some of the only areas that are being mined. They've improved the region, and so it's easier for the Spanish to take their improvements than to go off and do other things. Now there is an interesting thing. By 1574, the Spanish are going to have about 200 cities throughout this empire, and the population is of about 160,000 Spaniards Now, the way the Spanish control their empire is pretty strict, and I don't want to get into the weeds here. I'm already probably boring you with this, but basically, what I want to say here is that the Spanish are going to create this massive empire. They're going to hold on to it with both hands around the neck of it. There's really only one port for all of North America for trade, and that is at Veracruz. So you can see here, this is the only port really that Texas, like for example, if you want to know why was Texas so unpopulated even into the 1820s, it's because the distance from Texas all the way through Mexico to Veracruz was so great. There was no way to make money. There was no way to supply this area because of how strictly the Spanish controlled trade. They also were very strict in social classes. So if you were born in Spain, you were a peninsulare. You had no limit to the role that you could play in Spanish society in the New World. But if you were born in the Americas, you could be high-blooded nobility. But if you're born in the Americas, you are automatically a second-class citizen. You're not allowed to inhabit the highest levels of administration or wealth in the New World simply because of where you were born. So, there's going to be a lot of resentment. And, if we were studying the history of Mexico, we could talk about the Mexican Revolution that's happening, or that will happen in about 300 years. And a lot of that is happening because of the resentment between the Criollos and the Peninsulares and how they're going to be competing for rank and title. Another thing that we should mention, and I'm going to admit I'm not an expert on this, but there is, of course, the claims of horrible abuses by the Spanish of the native populations. No doubt there are numerous accounts of this type of abuse. Probably one of the principal examples of that is Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest and advocate for the native populations. He wrote several letters to Ferdinand in Spain advocating for the native populations about how they were being abused by what was called the encomienda system. Essentially, the Europeans, when the Spanish came over, they established feudalism. They established the same system of government that they used in Europe. They took the people, they forced them into serfdom, they forced them to labor on their land, and they absorbed all the wealth. That really isn't that much different than what Europeans were dealing with in Europe, right? So you had serfs in Europe. They didn't have any rights. They were basically slaves to these noblemen. And so natives were treated in many ways just as bad as some Europeans were. The big difference is natives didn't have the same value system. They didn't understand principles, that would get you killed, that would get you punished, theft and things like this. Many native cultures didn't have those concepts, and it could lead to disagreements and some atrocities. Also, these Spanish had been fighting the Muslims for 700 years. They were used to being conquerors for Christ. They were used to fighting to preserve and spread Christianity. And so when they came to this new world, they did the same exact thing. They fought and they spread Christianity. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. That's gonna color the interaction between the Spanish and the natives. But I think the biggest impact, and again, I'm no expert on this period of history, but if I'm just give you my perspective, I think the biggest impact is the disease. The spread of smallpox is going to kill tens of millions of people. A lot of modern critics of the Spanish will claim that, the Spanish were it was a genocide. It was the murder of tens of millions of natives, and the Spanish conquistadors, the Spanish conquerors, and Columbus, because he started the thing, are morally culpable in the deaths of these tens of millions of people. I think that's an overstatement. I think that's trying to do a little too much. These people didn't know about germ theory. There were some minor ideas that there might be these invisible things called germs, but that was an idea among scholars, and it was not as popular. It wouldn't become perfectly proven and popular until the 1800s. This is not something that people in 1500 would really have known about. Immunity to disease and the spread of disease is something that we're dealing with right now in our own pandemic. And if someone is COVID positive and they don't know it because they're asymptomatic, and they go someplace and someone gets sick and they die, is that murder? Are they culpable in the death of this other person? They're not knowingly trying to kill people. So I think you have to take into account the motivations. Now, is it possible that there were some Spaniards who purposefully tried to kill natives by coughing on them, or doing something like this? I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm just saying that these people don't know about germ theory. They're not experts in how to spread disease and virology and all this. And I think what we're doing is we're applying modern standards and ideas to previous people who are just ignorant. They don't know how diseases spread as well as we do now. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say it was a genocide. To me, a genocide is something that's purposeful. And no doubt, Cortez conquering the Aztec, that was purposeful. Don't get me wrong. There were plenty of examples of purposeful, war and things like that. But I think some of the statements are a little bit overboard. But we can talk about that in more detail. I suppose you can do some research on your own about some of that. Anyway, all right, so as the Spanish are building up their empire and exploiting the mines and improvements that natives have been making in this territory, other countries are definitely going to jump on board, particularly when you consider the fact that these slow-moving Spanish galleons loaded down with so much gold, they're just lumbering their way across the Atlantic. They are very easy targets for piracy. And so we need to talk about the rivalry between England and Spain. Of course, you know that, well, I don't know if you remember this or not, but in the 1500s, during the same time, you have a thing called the English Reformation. The Spanish are incredibly Catholic, very strong Catholics. The daughter to Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine of Aragon, married Henry VIII of England. So the connection between England and Spain is actually very close by marriage until he divorced her. He created his own country, his own country. Stupid. He created his own religion, his own sect of Christianity, granted himself a divorce, and then sort of exiled Catherine. And this angered the Spanish quite a bit. Obviously, this is going to ruin their relations. Later on, after the death of Henry VIII and his son Edward, Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and therefore sort of directly related to the Spanish throne and very Catholic in her own right, would become the Queen of England. And during her brief reign, she would marry Philip of Spain. So the King of Spain is going to marry his very close relative here in order to make connections with England and sort of unite England and Spain together. After Mary's death, probably due to like a cancer. I think she had cancer, some type of tumor that caused her death. After Mary's death, the King of Spain, Philip, he's going to say, "Hey, England's mine. I was the King of England through marriage, so your country now belong all to me." Right? That's kind of where he's coming from. The English are like, not so fast there, gentlemen. We have our own little queen that we want to put in place, and that is Henry's other daughter, named Queen Elizabeth, right? So this is Queen Elizabeth. Her reign will begin in 1558. Arguably one of the greatest and most influential English monarchs in the history of England. I don't think it's very hard to say that some of the most influential and important English rulers were in fact women. Right? And you have Elizabeth the First. You have Queen Victoria, who ruled for almost 70 years, 65 years, something like that. And then you have the present Queen of England, who's been in power since the mid-1950s. So women are playing a big part in ruling England. And, Queen Elizabeth, is not shy at stirring up the rivalry between, this new wealthy Spain and her own little country. And so she has these sea dogs, is what they're called. English sea dogs. They're basically pirates like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake. She knights them, right? So these are criminals. These are men that are going around stealing gold from the Spanish. Of course, the Spanish are stealing it, so they're stealing stolen gold, right? And so the English are saying, "Hey, you know what? You conquered it. You took this wealth through war and conquest. Well, then we'll do the same thing, right? We'll attack your little slow-moving ships. We'll confiscate your wealth." And then we'll get rich. And instead of punishing them the way Philip was hoping, Queen Elizabeth would knight them and and celebrate them, and this is going to lead to some problems, right? And we'll need to talk about what those problems are. Namely, the Spanish Armada, right? The Spanish king is going to create the largest armada in the history of armadas, and he is going to attempt to invade England multiple times. The first time he attempts it, he fails because I think it was Sir Francis Drake attacked a cork factory. I mean, you got to think outside the box. He attacked a cork factory and forced the Spanish fleet to withdraw. There you go. Who knew? Apparently, in order to keep fresh water in barrels, you need cork. And so Francis Drake attacked their cork factory so that they couldn't have fresh water, and they had to postpone their invasion for a couple of years. But they'd be back. In the 1580s, the Spanish would once again invade, and a hurricane would knock them off course. That, and of course, Sir Francis Drake would set his ships on fire and just sort of shoot them toward in the direction of the Spanish fleet, cause them to become all discombobulated, and along with a hurricane, that would wreck the Spanish, the famous Spanish Armada that attempted to invade England. So the Spanish are going to try to make something out of this, but the English, by the late 1580s, they're going to start dipping their toe in colonization efforts also in North America. So there are 6 reasons why the English are going to jump on board with this. One is land, right? They have a chance to get land. England is a little island. Getting more land for more people is a better idea because people tend to starve if they can't feed themselves. 2, religion. There's going to be a lot of religious conflict in England, particularly after the English Reformation. You've got Catholics who are very angry inside England. You've also got Anglican Church having a little war within itself, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's going to inspire some colonization in the 1600s. Political freedom, right? People want to be able to have a little more say in their lives. Every time the king or queen changes, you're forced to convert to a different religion, and people want political freedom. They want the freedom to worship the way they want and to have a say in their own government. Next, money, right? So there's always that gold motivation. These people are investors. They want to try to go to this new world and hopefully strike it rich the way Cortez and Pizarro did. Maybe they'll find some great civilization that their modern weapons will allow them to conquer, and they can exploit for wealth. 5, a spirit of adventure. They just want to go out, and that's the glory part, right? I mean, you sit in your house, you think you know everything, and then there's this chance to go out and do something amazing. I mean, think in the next decade or so, Elon Musk and some of these other explorers, they're gonna say, hey, we're gonna put an expedition together. We're gonna get some colonists. We're gonna go to the moon. We're gonna go to Mars, and people are gonna do it. They're gonna. I mean, you have a chance to go down in history if you survive. You write your memoirs, and you can be like William Bradford, and people will read your book for all of time because you will have recorded the early history of life on some foreign planet or moon. And so there's a great advantage to this. Yeah, so a spirit of adventure is definitely going to be a reason to inspire the English to expand and colonize. The last reason is it's basically the national policy of England to stop the Spanish from getting all this wealth and becoming this major power that they can't compete with. So these 6 reasons are going to really encourage the English to jump on board with this exploration. Now, just to kind of keep you in line with what's happening, I wanted to show you, who are the Tudors? Who are these kings and queens that are getting involved in exploration? Well, obviously, you see Henry VII, as I mentioned, the Cabot Voyages. Henry VIII would blow up the church with the English Reformation, and then you have Elizabeth with the break with Rome, and Sir Francis Drake and his pirates, along with the Spanish Armada. So you can see that the English are definitely attempting to compete with the Spanish, and they're absolutely going to jump on board with colonization attempts. We're going to talk about these in more detail with the next lecture. Obviously, we'll talk about the Chesapeake Bay region, which was the first permanent settlement that the English would put into place. But I wanted to just finish up by talking about three big deal. I mean, we mentioned 6 reasons why, but I want to go into more detail on 3 of those because the motivations behind what the English are doing is a big difference between what's happening with the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese. I mean, the English are going to create little mini Englands. They're not going to just exploit the natives. They want the land, not the people, right? So they're after this thing for a different reason. So we need to look at their motivations here. 1, economics. Trade is going to build a middle class in England that begins to challenge the power of the aristocracy. And the creation of these joint stock companies, which allow people to pool their resources in order to go and do these explorations, means that these are privately funded expeditions. This is not the Spanish king taking his private wealth from the state and giving it to someone to go on an expedition. The King of England doesn't have that kind of power. The Queen of England doesn't have that kind of money. Because of Magna Carta, Parliament controls tax rates. Parliament controls the purse in England. And as a result of that, the Queen doesn't really have the power to do that. Now she can give permission to operate in the name of England, so to speak, but you got to come up with the money yourself. And so these joint stock companies are going to sort of spur English colonization, and that's very different than what's happening with Spain and the French. Number 2, surplus population. You're going to have this booming wool industry. It's going to force farmers off their land as people begin to grow sheep and flocks of sheep for the purposes of making wool. And this is going to force a lot of people into poverty, and they're going to be pretty desperate for a solution to that. And the New World will serve as an escape valve, a safety valve for these people who are pretty destitute and willing to risk their lives for a chance to get some land. Another aspect of this is the collapse of the Catholic Church in England, and this is going to lead to suddenly there's no support system for people who are in poverty. There's no charitable institutions anymore like there was at one time. And finally, the Protestant Reformation is going to push a lot of people out of England and into the New World. There are a lot of dissatisfied people from Protestants and Catholics who are going to look to the Americas as a way to get away from this monarch that sort of controls your private religious life. So these are 3 of the more specific things, and when we get back tomorrow, we'll talk about Roanoke in 1585, along with Popham Colony, which very few people know about, but it's one of the earlier colonies that the English set up. All right, so I'll see you next time. We'll talk about the Chesapeake Bay region.